All right. Thank you, Scott. Good evening, everyone. I'll call this meeting to order. Welcome to the Coeur d'Alene School District 271 Special Board Meeting for March 15th, 2021. I'd like to introduce our participants for this evening. Starting on my far right is Mr. Casey Morrisroe, board member. Next to him, Mrs. Lisa May, board member. To my immediate left is Rebecca Smith, vice chair, and then Tambra Pickford, board member, and I am Jennifer Brumley, the chair. Also joining us tonight is Dr. Cook, to Tambra Pickford's left, our superintendent, and then back behind Mr. Morrisroe is Lynn Town, clerk of the board. No public comment will be accepted during tonight's meeting. However, comments may always be submitted to the board using trustees@cdaschools.org or through the clerk at any time. Issues may be recorded and referred to the proper staff member for follow-up. Thank you. All right, at this time, do I have a motion for approval of the agenda?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Our first item up is a consent agenda item that was part of our board packet for the bid awards regarding UPS and network switches. So do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And then the next consent agenda item is just the technology equipment for surplus. We don't need a vote. Did anybody have any questions or comments on that issue? Okay. And so then that will quickly put us on to one of the two main reasons we're here this evening. And that is to hear from our consultants with HYA regarding the leadership profile report. And there they are. We're getting them up on Zoom. Good evening, ladies. How are you? Can you hear it? Can you hear me? I think you're both muted, so make sure. Okay.
Yes. We are unmuted now.
Well, I think the public's familiar with you. I know we've had you at our prior workshop, but Jackie's on the top and Carolyn is on the bottom. And I'm going to turn it over to one of you two ladies.
I'll start. I'm Carolyn McKinnon. Jackie Horsch is my colleague. We represent Hazard Youngity and Associates, a longtime established search firm, and we are proud and pleased to be a part of that. We also want to thank you for the opportunity tonight to come before you and share some of the things that we find most interesting and relevant to the search process. And we also want to thank you and express our gratitude for the support and enthusiasm we've received every place, not literally place, but every virtual place we went and spoke with people. We were well received and treated with high regard. So thank you so much for that. We want to begin by sharing a little bit about the search process, and we may go back and forth because there are some elements to the process that are just a little bit different. But we began our search process by interviewing. We first interviewed all 5 board members, and you made yourselves available to us quickly, and you gave us good information. We also interviewed some other folks individually, and then we moved to focus groups. These focus groups interviews, as well as the individual interviews, were conducted on, I think we were here 6 or 7 days, the 8th, 9th, 10th, 16th, 17th, and 22nd. Not always all day, but portions of each of the days so that we could be involved with as many persons as possible. We met 87 people in this focus group or interview process. In addition, we saw 604 individuals in the district complete the survey. And just a brief moment about the survey. Thank you, Jackie. The survey looks at leadership qualities and characteristics based on research. And we use that word sincerely and a little bit with some information because this is not necessarily a search per se, but we'll talk about that. So all 6 of the constituent groups came together. People self-selected if they wanted to complete that survey, they could. In the survey, they identified themselves in their role, and Jackie will talk a little bit about that survey. So one of the most significant things we've learned in this process has to do with the survey, and it's something we don't typically see. But in this survey, the groups that filled it out, whether that was board members, online board members, cabinet members, teachers, students, classified employees, all of the people that came together to fill out that survey, they identified as constituent groups, all 6 of them identified this characteristic: foster a positive professional climate of mutual trust and respect among faculty, staff, and administrators. That is a significant piece. We don't usually find that much agreement with all groups across the board. And of course, there was a second one that was significant, but that one is the most significant in our eyes. And Jackie's going to pick up here.
Well, and I thought I saw somebody doing this screen share, and if you could put that back up, we have a chart that's on that, and it would be slide number 4. So it is right there. And I don't know, can you folks see that? It's kind of,
I can't.
somebody,
It's getting there,
There
Jackie. Yes, now we have it.
thank you. Okay. So we just wanted to show you this because we really feel that it's important that you see the numbers of people that were actually given an individual interview or participated in focus groups. And all 5 of the board members, as you know, were individually interviewed. We interviewed the community members and parents, the district committee, students, classified staff, teachers, with the total that came up to 87. As Carolyn pointed out, the online survey has a really large number of participants, over 600. What we'd like you to know, though, is that for the community group, this included representatives from each of the trustee zones, as well as local business leaders. And you need to remember that this isn't a scientific sampling. Really and truly, we're looking at the information because it represents opinions that we believe are important for the board to become aware of as you're looking at what it is that the new superintendent needs to have in terms of characteristics and what the challenges that are perceived by your stakeholders seems to be. So if you would go on to the next slide, please.
Jackie?
Yes.
Before you walk away from that, note that when on the survey, community members were represented by themselves, parents were represented by themselves. So 340 parents. The reason they're together in some respects is because some of the focus grouping we did in groups, but single out those that did. The survey was done individually.
Right. Thank you. And that brings us to another thank you. We really do owe a debt of thanks to Lynn Town, who I know is in this meeting and just did an amazing amount of work for us in terms of organization and scheduling and just always being there whenever we needed her. So big thanks to you, Lynn. And of course, the board liaison, your board president, Jennifer Brumley, again, thank you for all the work that you've put into this search. We appreciate partnering with you on this, and we're very thankful for your leadership. So thank you so much. Next slide, please. Carolyn, you're going to do that.
Once again, this is another part of our process, and this has to do with 4 questions that we ask everyone. We ask board members, parents, cabinet members, support staff, teachers, students. Everyone in the interview process was asked the same questions. What are the strengths of the district? And here we're looking for those things that you're particularly proud of, those things you don't want to lose in the transition to a new superintendent, those things that you have worked hard. I always say it makes my heart sing. That's how I feel about some of the things that districts have accomplished. Then we want to talk about the challenges. What do you see in the next 3, 4, 5 years? What do you see as something coming toward the district that you'll need to be prepared for, something that you see is going to be a challenge for the district? And then the third one is desired characteristics. And in this case, we ask people What do you want this new superintendent to be like? What qualities and characteristics do you want him or her to bring to the district? Describe this person in terms of, so when we go looking at applicants, we can see what it is you want. And that's another important characteristic, is we want to be sure that we are matching the candidates we're looking at with the characteristics, the challenges, and the strengths you see. And then we ask people, anybody you think would make a good superintendent? And we took down some names. We think this was something that we'll talk about, and we'll share some more of the actual strengths and challenges and desired characteristics along the way. But before we go there, we wanted to talk a little bit about this. Why are we doing this report? How is it useful? So maybe you could flip that next slide, maybe. There you go. We want you to see how we use this leadership profile. It's more than just a document. Sometimes they say we do all this work and we put it on the shelf and we never even dust it off again. But in our case, that is not true. There are about 5 reasons that we do this leadership profile, and this is how we use it. And first and foremost, it does assist the board in determining the desired characteristics of the new superintendent. The board will see a lot of information about what people see as, we want our new superintendent to be like this, and we'll share some of those with you later. It also informs candidates about the district and the expectations for this new superintendent. For us, it's a recruiting tool, and when we interview, we'll pre-screen candidates that we think would be good matches for the district, and we will expect that they have looked at this leadership profile also in determining whether, should I have applied, am I a good match for this district? And I just said it will assist us in screening the candidates. And then later on, when the board gets down to those semifinalists, they're going to prepare about 15 questions that they're going to ask the semifinalist candidates. And this will assist the board in the development of the interview questions, because that's one of their responsibilities. And then, of course, when the new superintendent comes on board, this will be an excellent tool for him or her to know about the district, to learn about the district. And quite frankly, we would expect them to have already poured over this report before they even arrive on their first day once they're selected. All right, next slide, please. We're now looking at a summary of the district's strengths. And if you had a chance to see this leadership profile, you'll see there are pages and pages of each group as they were individually interviewed, telling us, not group, individually, each group as they interviewed as a group. You will see all of the things they saw as challenges, all of the things they saw as strengths and characteristics. But we're going to now just give you a summary of what we think what it looks like. So just quickly, because again, if we read every comment we have, it will be a long board meeting. And we've been in long board meetings and we know they're not always pleasurable. So we ask people the question, what are the strengths of the district? What is it you desire to retain and build upon? And when people were giving us comments, the comments could be built on other comments, because if they're in a group, they hear what someone says, that triggers a response in them. So we had participants chiming in, so to speak, when they thought about things that they wanted wanted us to know about the district's strengths. A quick look at some of them: flexible and creative schools, health benefits were valued, high-performing school districts, leadership at the sites. People want that to be strong. They want parent involvement. They want community support. And by the way, one of the strengths was you've always been successful in passing your levies, and congratulations. That's a big plus. Portrait of graduate with your curriculum plan, professional development. And they also like parents who have attended either Coeur d'Alene schools or graduated from Coeur d'Alene, have some connection to the district. The size and the location of the district is very desirable. If anybody's ever been to Coeur d'Alene, you could speak to that. Social emotional learning is part of your strategic plan. They're looking for someone who's committed to student achievement. And your strategic plan is built upon some of the aspects of the audit and stakeholder input. And of course, student agency is appreciated by the students, and they also appreciate that they have dedicated and highly professional teaching staff. Flip that next slide.
So the next question, as we've mentioned before, has to do with asking all of the individuals and the focus groups and everyone who took the survey, what do they see as the issues that are currently, the district's currently facing? Those things that are challenges, not only today, but that are going to continue to be challenges the district will be facing in the next 3 to 5 years. And again, there were many individual responses, but when we, kind of cross-cut and triangulated them, these are some of the things that really sort of bubbled up to the top as being very consistent among the various groups. So one of the things had to do with, just a concern about board and superintendent role ambiguity. That's always a slippery slope for relationships between board members and the superintendent. So it was noted that that's something that, is going to be perhaps a concern that the new superintendent is really going to need to be working with the board on. Also, relative to the board were concerns about board elections coming up in the future, not knowing how that's going to change the composition of the board. Other things that were mentioned as being issues might be the concern about building trust and establishing positive relationships with all stakeholder groups, because it was mentioned that there are certainly very disparate political voices in the community, political differences in the community. And so one issue would be ensuring that everyone has a voice and being able to effectively communicate with all of those various voices. Another thing that was an issue coming up, current and in the future, is the changing demographics due to the influx of new residents and the rate of growth that the district is seeing. Speaking of growth, housing costs and the lack of availability of places to actually live was seen as being a concern that impacts recruiting and retention of qualified staff. Another thing that was mentioned was the inequity in terms of school facilities. Apparently, this is something that is going to need to be faced in the future, is ensuring that there's more consistent levels of learning facilities available to all of your students. Turnover at the top, meaning the lack of stability in the superintendent position, was noted as a possible, issue coming up in the future. Hopefully not. We're very hopeful that the next superintendent that you are selecting is going to be with you a long time, but it was mentioned as a concern. Also, and again, congratulations on your levy, but maintaining community support, ensuring that you continue to have that high level of support that you always had. State funding is always a concern in the state and continues to be a concern and probably will always be a concern. But that was certainly mentioned many times. And the teachers mentioned that they, felt a concern was not being included in the decision-making processes, curriculum, reopening, and other things that really impact them. So knowing that that's a concern, I think will be important for that next superintendent. So those are the summary statements that we have to share with you. And now we're going to go to the next slide, please.
The next one is desired characteristics, and this is an amalgamation of all of the things we heard. And it's a lengthy list, and if we had the whole list up, it would be more pages. But what we're looking for is the expectation for what will this new person need to bring, personal and professional characteristics. What does he or she need to bring to the district to meet all of the challenges that have been noted, as well as the characteristics and qualities that people desire in this new superintendent. So we'll just hit a few of the highlights and in alpha order, as they say. Given some of what you heard already, they're looking for someone who has the ability to navigate a polarized community in some respects and withstand pushback. They want someone who can implement a shared vision based on the strategic plan and the portrait of a graduate. They want someone who's approachable, who's available. And that's really important. And you heard quite a bit of that as people want to be able to have a relationship with the superintendent. That's important to many of your groups. They want someone who will authentically partner and build relationships with your site administrator team. And the authentic part is something people want to maintain. They want to have relationships that are meaningful. They want someone who believes in equity and sees things through an equity lens. Obviously, they want someone who has budget acumen. And here's another one that's in bold, clearly delineates appropriate board superintendent roles and responsibilities and has experience working with boards. They want someone who will use the strength of team members. They want someone who's committed to staying for a while. They're looking for stability in the position. They want someone who, we talk about change and managing growth, no matter where you are, that will be a responsibility of any superintendent that stays very long. They want someone who's forward thinking, who's visionary, who has innovation, inspiring and passionate, and an instructional leader, of course. And they want someone who will be involved in the community, make him or her presence known, get involved at the state level as well. They want someone who builds relationships, someone who's invested in this community, strong communication skills, and that harkens back to some of what we saw on the survey. And if you get a chance to take a look at the survey, it has multiple pages, but you'll see things that will correlate with what we've shared, as well as giving you some insight into what it is that each group thinks, because the survey, you see what each group believes and values by their group mention. So you'll see the students, what they believe and value, what the teachers believe and value, based on the 12 questions they have to answer. And that survey gives you 12 possibilities, and you get to only pick 4. Now, this is the one where you're looking to try to, this is maybe the part we see that has the research behind it in terms of what a high quality superintendent generally brings to a district. And now you can put it down to your level. Student-centered, they talk about trustworthy and trusting, and in bold, a unifier and a bridge builder. And again, someone who's visible in the schools. They want you to come in, spend some time, maybe not disruptive time, but spend the time in classrooms. And they also want someone who will value everyone's worth to the district. And again, this authentic partnership is something they want to have in their new superintendent. We are ready to take questions, Madam President, if that is something you'd like to entertain.
Well, thank you very much, Jackie and Carolyn. And for anybody interested, as part of our board packet, all of those groups are broken out and identified within the document that was submitted by Jackie and Carolyn to us. That has a lot more detail in it, but this was just a short summary. So thank you for that. And with that, does any trustees have questions?
I don't have a question about the document, and thanks, ladies, for presenting that information tonight. My question was just about it. I know patrons or staff can go see that through our board book, but that can be a little tricky sometimes if you're not familiar with doing that. I was just wondering, is it going to be posted, or has it been posted on our superintendent search page on our website, or maybe could we do that?
Yes, it's got around. That's a great idea. Yes, of course. And it's on our website as well. But I think people are used to coming to the district's website. So yeah. And we need to thank Scott too. He's also been a major source of information and help. And sometimes he beats us to the question, should I do this? Well, we were thinking of that too. So yeah, he's been a real resource.
So our board clerk said that she will post it under the superintendent search portion of our website. So thank you, Lynn. All right, ladies, you did such a great job. Nobody has any questions for you. So thank you again for your time this evening. I know we'll be seeing a lot more of each other down the road. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too. Appreciate the time. Thank you.
Okay, so that brings us to our last item, not a small item, of counselor procedure and guidance discussion. And I will turn it over to Superintendent Cook.
Thank you, Chair Brumley. As you guys can see in the board book, what we wanted to put in the board book was materials that would help develop kind of the context of a discussion. We've had an incident that happened earlier in the year that really drew a lot of attention and scrutiny to the work of our counselors, and I think it's worthy of a conversation for us to determine essentially if the laws as they're written in the state of Idaho regarding that relationship with counselors and their role in the schools, or our policies and our guidance as in the mechanism and the way they function in the schools is appropriately being delivered, or if they are being appropriately delivered, or secondly, if when they get into controversial subjects or topics that may be challenging, one of the things that we recognize and that administratively that we support is the fact that our counselors are critical to the success and the role that they function in the district, and are quite intimately involved in the functioning and the ongoings of the schools in which they respectively serve and the success of students in those schools. And whether or not there are obligations that we are not delivering upon in some fashion, either by policy, by procedure, or by just how we administer to those in those roles. And so what we would like to do, we presented you with kind of the legal basis, the policy basis, and even two things that I think also frame this conversation. There's a set of what I've come to now know as they're considered guidelines that the district adopted in 2014, not necessarily policies that the district adopted in 2014 that that kind of framed out a position regarding gender identity in the community, or at least in the school district, and with relationship to that community, which is currently the standing guidance when it comes to gender identity with our student population and how we administer to that. And that's been in position now since 2014, along with a model policy that was provided by ISBA on what gender identity conversations might look like in the roles of schools and how we approach those. And I think what we would like to potentially have a discussion with the board about and hear from your positions is whether or not there are gaps in those. We would posit that we believe that our counselors do an amazing job and partner very, very effectively with our families, and especially when these controversial subjects come up, whether it's in elementary or secondary, they do a fantastic job at building those connections. And I think we do run into some challenges when we have parents and guardians that aren't quite necessarily responsive to the outreach, and then that we have to deal with those kinds of difficulties. And how do you balance that need for attention and confidentiality that a student would want when you're also trying to respect that dynamic? And that's also one of the inclusions that you have in your board book is what our current guidance are on parental rights and the expectations that we live by every single day in those administration of those. And I think what we're hoping to accomplish today is maybe a dialogue around those things, and potentially, depending on how that dialogue goes, some recommendations on what we think we might want to consider moving forward. So I would stop at that point and sit for questions. And I've got legal ready and available to answer questions. We've got both of our assistant superintendents available. We've got many of our cabinet members, so that there are opportunities to dive into many of those areas deeply if you are so inclined, or if you want to stay at a pretty high level. I'm glad to be a part of that, as well as I'm really good at not very deep. But I have a great team that can help answer a lot of questions. But I would tell you right now, this has been a topic of much interest in the community and with parents, and also much interest within our staff. We've had lots and lots of feedback, lots of input from lots of different folks. And I think that's why it's worthy of conversation and why it's worthy of the board's consideration and discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. I will open it up to comments or questions from trustees.
I just wonder if, Dr. Cook, would it be possible, I don't know if it would be you or Ms. O'Dowd, but just maybe summarize, it's tricky, as I was looking at this over the last several months and talking about it, there's lots of different caveats, and I think difficult to develop a policy that's too specific because there's so many variables. And one that sticks into my mind is if a student came to a counselor or any staff member with an allegation of abuse of some sort, and kind of the duty to report those sorts of things, or self-harm is another one, violence. Could someone just kind of summarize what are those that are by statute or federal law, whatever it be, I assume it's by statute, that are required reportable incidents?
Certainly. So what I would just like to start by saying, first of all, is that what I think I understand you talking about, Trustee Morse-Rowe, is that by law, school district employees, all school district employees are mandatory reporters. And if given information or reason to believe that these circumstances might warrant a report to authorities that could act upon those things, there are certain criteria in which we are required, quite specifically, that confidentiality is not a guarantee. And so what I would like to do is ask Attorney Megan O'Dowd to kind of opine on what those criteria are and when we would have to enact and act upon those as school district employees or people associated with the district in that regard.
Thank you, Superintendent Cook, members of the board. There are basically two statutory grounds for when any, and Dr. Cook put it very well. It doesn't just apply to counselors, where this would apply to all school officials and staff. So the first would be under Idaho Code 33512. So if we have evidence of known self-harm, there is a duty to report that as appropriate. So sometimes that may be a parent or legal guardian or some other person to protect the child. We have to give notice of that potential self-harm. The second would be Idaho Code 16-1605, and that's a report to Department of Health and Welfare or CPS services when there is instances of known abuse or neglect. Those are defined terms by statute and mean a variety of things. But those are the two situations where any individual, including a counselor, must disclose.
So is there any, so there's no statutory requirement if a student comes to talk to a counselor or an adult, there's no statutory requirement to report to the parent?
Trustee Morse-Rowe, no, there's nothing in statute that requires some sort of disclosure to parents in the event that a student goes to a school counselor for any type of support services. In fact, our Idaho Code statutes, the legislature has essentially given implied consent with respect to students seeking out counseling, school counselor services, and that's at K through 12 by statute, that these counselors are going to be there to, and the legislature provides very broad language about that the school counselors are supposed to be there to address a wide variety of diverse issues that may be faced by the students. And there's no additional statutory obligation that when when those services are sought out by students, that we inform the parents of that communication. And in fact, doing so in just as a general matter without any sort of special circumstances may very well violate these licensed counselors' professional obligations under the Asca rules, which are incorporated by reference in our school board policy for school counselors. And these professional guidance, and I think the board should have copies of some of that information in the board packet tonight. Those professional obligations very clearly set a standard that there is an expectation of confidentiality between the student and the counselor, and frankly, for a variety of reasons, but to promote those communications and to allow for a safe space and transparency for those conversations. And the professional standards do say that you have to comply with law if there is supposed to be a disclosure, but otherwise doesn't necessarily mandate things unless there's like a self-harm. That those are the kind of the general areas where the professional standards also would require some disclosures.
Ms. O'Dowd, that was the ASCA ethics document. Is that what you were referring to there?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. So it does, I guess, I've looked at lots of different just policies and state rules around this and seen a number of different things. I think Utah, for example, requires you to opt in to school counseling services. Every parent has to do it on an annual basis. And I brought some of those forms just because it was interesting, I think, to see how they do that. But looking at the ASCA ethics rules, there's a couple things that stood out to me as far as responsibilities to parents and guardians. One, and I'm just going to summarize them, but was to collaborate with students, parents, and guardians. And another one was to inform parents and guardians of the confidential nature of counseling relationships. And I think to me, that's important, that parents understand that some communication could be confidential. But I think it's also important, as I look at this with my parent hat, that we want to support our children. And that's why we all serve on this board, I assume. And so I would want to know, personally, if my child was seeing a counselor, and maybe I don't need to know specifics about what that is, that I can, have that conversation with my own child, but I would want to know so I could be a resource and a support for my student. And I know by and large that's the practice within the district, but that's not specified in policy. And so as we have this conversation over the next few months and we look to improve upon our policy, that's perhaps one area that I would be interested in just solidifying that and making it more uniform as some sort of notification to the parent that their child saw a counselor and came in. I pulled something from American School Counselors Association, so same group here, ASCA, and it says, this was in a fact document they had, but best practice is to inform parents and guardians when you are providing individual counseling for a student over more than 1 or 2 sessions. And I don't think that's too much to ask. Hearing from what we heard from our counselors over the last week or two, and we had a number of them reach out with their thoughts. I understand, the nature of the work they're doing, and they want to be able to respond and help kids. That's why they do what they do, and they do a great job of it. And so you don't want to be, sorry, I can't talk to you right now. I need to call your parents up and get their permission, or I need to let them know, because you got to deal with that crisis right now, and whatever it is. And so I like this idea of maybe it's after 1 or 2, kind of a continuing counseling over the same issue, that there's some information shared with the parent, even if that's just because of confidentiality, is, hey, just need to let you know your child's come in and asked to speak with me. And, I can't share specifics with you without your child's consent.
Megan, in light of Trustee Morse-Rowe's comments, is there a delineation between the content of the conversation and the disclosure that a conversation occurred?
Thank you, Chair Brumley. By statute, there is very little guidance. I mean, I've already identified the very two concrete grounds where we must disclose. The rest is, and frankly, I guess I would defer a little bit. I don't know that I am the appropriate person. I think a lot of this would be based on input from your counselors and the various goals. I think one of the running themes and concerns with the disclosure, certainly there is a distinction between giving the content of the communication versus just a notice that that a meeting occurred without any description of what the underlying content is. I think that there are risks, and I've seen some of that information in the Asca documents as well. The concern is whether, and this is why I think maybe Dr. Cook has proposed that it be in guidelines so that there be some, I am hesitant to put it in policy because I don't know how exacting we can be, because a lot of this will just be based on the specific facts. But there will be some situations where even notifying a parent of a communication and potentially the counselor didn't even know could expose that child to harm. And those might be few and far between, but that may be a situation where kiddo has never disclosed anything to a teacher or a counselor so that they would know why, kiddo is reaching out. And then when parent finds out about it, shuts it down and exposes the child to harm. So I think those are the types of concerns of providing any type of notice, but I would agree that there's certainly a distinction between notifying a parent about a meeting or a frequent meeting versus providing the content, which I think would be a very, at least based on the documents that I've read, I think as a professional practice would be something that would probably not be favored by the counselors.
And if I may jump in here, I think part of what we're trying to determine is whether or not we would be putting policy in place that strengthens the relationship between the student, the counselor, and the family, or if we're putting policy in place that could inhibit that. And that's a balancing act. And I would guess that right now, all of us are seeing it from a lens of governance and policy generation, and what would more likely be a quicker and more effective resolution would be for counselors to sit down as a group and a collective and say, where is that policy? Because I think generally we do a pretty decent job. No, I would say, I'll take it a step further. I think we do a really good job of collaborating and working with parents and guardians when it comes to challenging circumstances. And counselors would be the first to tell you that they want to be a resource for students when dealing with challenging circumstances. And we don't want to necessarily inhibit that interaction, but at the same time, we want to honor the role and the responsibility of the parent in helping their students navigate those challenges, and how we then honor that role as well. And for us to, to me, what I would want is to pose that dichotomy to our counselors and say, what would it look like if it were going to be effectively, our goal is to partner with the parents, and our goal is to also help this student resolve this issue that they're struggling with, whatever it may be. How do we live in that Venn diagram of those two circles, that we're meeting those students' needs with also meeting the expectations of the parent, but not putting students at risk, or parents or guardian, but not putting students at risk when it comes to what are those controversial subjects, what are those topics that are going to be challenging when students are bringing them. Sometimes that's the reason the student brings those to the counselors, because that's where they feel the most comfortable bringing those situations. And I'm not saying that we need to serve in that capacity in lieu of the parent, or the guardian by any means, but at the same time, our counselors serve a very critical role in that regard.
Yeah, Dr. Cook, to that end, it's difficult to have this conversation without a counselor present to answer our questions today. So I just want that to be noted, that I think this conversation would be more robust today if we were listening to them, because there's probably 5 questions right now I'd like to ask a counselor. I was really glad to see them reach out and kind of share with what their role looks like. I learned a lot about the services or just the support they provide for our students. But in that, since they're not here, maybe you could speak on their behalf and talk a little bit about the education that they have, because our counselors are highly educated individuals that carry licensures and certifications. And I think it's an important role that we discuss. So can you speak, or Megan or whoever wants to take that on, about, who we hire for the counseling positions, what it entails, what their education looks like, and how they are trained to provide these services?
Of course, I can do a layman's job on that. I think it's important to note that, first of all, to recognize that our counselors are highly trained. They are highly educated, and quite frankly, they're trained to the level in which I believe that by license they could be personal therapists for students, but we don't use them in that capacity necessarily. And when the nature of the conversations get into the level of what might be considered personal counseling, we do a lot of connecting them to outside resources, and our counselors serve in that capacity. And I think what I would want in that regard, when it comes to some of this controversy or subjects that are just so contentious, and I want to come back to it. Remember, our counselors all, without exception, begin by trying to connect that conversation back to the families, back to the guardians, in the regards of how they're going to navigate their path forward from the very beginning. And I think if what they would like, and if I don't know that I'm prepared to speak for them in this regard, but I would say that one of the things that I think would be clear is, what do we want for them, and how do we have them navigate that conversation so that they could bring us recommendations on what's the easiest way, because they do know that level of understanding to some extent better than we do. And I think that's where this conversation for me lives, is right in that crux of how do you balance those needs, because nobody is, our counselors would be the first to tell you that we're not trying to serve in lieu of the guardians, but how do they honor the requirements, the requests, and the needs of the child in that particular moment, in that ask, and how do they partner with them? And so they're highly qualified, they're highly trained, and they balance those needs. To some extent, I wonder if maybe there's some opportunity for us to bring our counselors together and get a little more dialed in on what those expectations might look like, and maybe do some formal declarations on how we try to be a little more consistent with that. And that might be some of the conversation. I'd love to be in a room with all of them and have them kind of talk that through, and then bring something back to this board for consideration, I think.
Yeah, because I do feel like one piece that we can get hung up on without them here to answer the questions is, counseling is a very broad term, and the kind of counseling that our counselors are providing isn't individual therapeutic counseling. And I had the opportunity to speak to a middle school counselor, and she described it as they're kind of the triage people. And first and foremost, parents are in that conversation, and they're reaching out to guardians, and they're making sure that students have resources they need, or referring them back to their family, or if it's about duty to inform, making sure that they're getting immediate resources when it's needed. But they're not providing one-on-one counseling sessions. So I think that's an important clarification that we need to make. And I guess I wish if maybe Megan could speak to that, but I want the community to know that those are services that are out of the scope of what our school counselors are doing on a day-to-day basis. So I think that might clear up some of where the confusion is. I worry, Casey, you were mentioning notifying parents, every time a student reaches out to a counselor. And one of the anecdotal stories I heard today was, I might have a student drop by who's had a fight with her best friend, and she just wants resources. How can I be a better friend? How can I be a better listener? Is that something that we would elevate, that we have to notify a parent that a student stopped by and said, hey, I'm having a problem with my best friend, I just want some tips? Those are pretty basic counseling sessions that don't, in my opinion, require a parent to be notified that a student stopped by. So I think we need to really clarify what we're going after, and I think you kind of started that bit of the conversation, but because they are very different scenarios.
Right, and I think when I originally looked at this or thought about this, I thought, make it happen in Skyward, and I know when my kid skipped 6 periods, you can tell me when you came and talked to the counselor, but I understand the burden that's putting on someone. Someone has to do that. And I don't need to know every time my kid went to the counselor to say, hey, I want to be in second lunch because all my friends are. You know, I don't want to see that. And so that's when I came across this document from ASCA that talked about notification when it's one or more sessions or two or more sessions, whatever the number is, but something on a more ongoing basis, something that's not just kind of a one and done. I've given them some tools to talk to their friend and figure out, you know, how to stand up for themselves or whatever it is, something that's more ongoing. You mentioned something there that I thought was important, too, is, you know, that the counseling we're doing shouldn't be a replacement for you know, for therapy or that sort of thing. And, you know, I wonder with 18 schools and not kind of defined guidelines or practices, if it is time just to bring the counselors together to set some of that framework, that we're never going to know the intricacies of all of that, but what does counseling service look like, and how do we refer to other people, and who are we referring to, and make it a little more consistency and provide equity, you know, across all of our buildings, that they're all getting the same type of referral services. It's not just this school because they have the counselor that's been there for 20 years and knows everybody and knows how to get a kid into Heritage Health or whatever it is, but that we can do that for all of our schools. And we've all seen that through student hearings. You know, it's tough to get your child into a counselor in any community. And I think, you know, we've been able to sometimes make some phone calls and say, hey, can you expedite this? This kid needs some help. But how can we do that for all of our students and provide that? And so I think you're on the right track. I agree with you that we're not going to be able to pull this off without some counselor input in that. But, you know, we may be the bridge between the counselors and the parents, and what do the parents want, and you know, that sort of thing. So I will share this one document because it talks a lot about that. I'll give it to Lynn and just ask her to send it to you. But this is from Cache County in Utah. But it's their opt-out form, but it says a couple things that I liked. One is parents or guardians or school staff may refer students or for counseling, or students may request counseling for themselves. School counseling services are short-term services aimed at more effective education and socialization of the child within the school community. Excuse me. These services are not intended as a substitute for diagnosis or treatment of any mental health disorder. To build trust with student, the school counselor will keep information confidential with some expectations. Because these services are provided to minor children in the school setting, the school counselor may share information with parents and guardians, the child's teacher, or administrators or school personnel who work with the child on a need-to-know basis, so that they may better assist the child. The counselor is also required by law to share information with parents and others in the event the child is in danger or may harm themselves or others. The counselor will make the child aware in an age-appropriate manner of these limits to confidentiality and will inform the child when sharing information with others. So, you know, just some of those things we talked about, they've kind of spelled out. So I think there are some resources out there if we want to, you know, ask our counselors to start building a document that provides some uniformity across the district.
Dr. Cook, one thing off that, thank you, Trustee Morris-Rowe. I'd like to know and hear back from the counselors as well, as far as what do they need? You know, is there professional development needs that are being met or aren't being met? Are there things within the district that they need in order to better do their job and to strengthen their job? Throughout this process, I keep coming back to our social and emotional learning framework. And throughout it, I really feel like the community needs to hear this right now, but that throughout it is the partnerships with families. I mean, multiple times, I took the entire thing and went through it multiple times, and it says we're going to strengthen the relationships between between schools and families. And the first step is acting to create a culture of safety with parents, caregivers, and the community at large, where non-school personnel feel like the school building and system is theirs, where they can welcome and have a voice. And so how Dr. Cook, are counselors being involved in that process and the carrying out of this framework so that we can take it farther? I mean, throughout this entire framework, it's partnerships with families. And so how are we doing that really at the counseling level? And I'm not sure I'm super clear on that, but I'd love some feedback on how are we doing that? How are we carrying out that framework? It seems like it's key, especially in this, just to highlight that parent-family relationship.
I think what you've brought attention to, Trustee Smith, is just simply the relationship with the strategic plan, where we want to go in the district, the relationship and the desire or the want for that partnership with the families to be able to deliver on the expectations that we want for each and every child in our school system. And how do school counselors play a key role in that process? And I think that I would tell you, I think that it's fair to say that they know and understand how they fit policy-wise in that conversation. I think if you ask them, if we spent some time saying, okay, here's what the social emotional learning framework says, what's your role and capacity in this? I think what they would want is an opportunity to talk with each other, just like Trustee May and Trustee Morse-Rowe explained, and frame that out to some extent, how they see themselves being both a delivery mechanism, a tool for helping students achieve those outcomes, and what their role is in providing that space for students in each of our schools. And so I think there's two pieces to that, and that's number one, the first piece is the fact that they currently know and administer to those guidelines, those policies that are in place. And I think the exciting part of that would be if we just set them down and said, okay, social emotional learning framework on the table, equity framework on the table. Here's what our outcomes are that we desire for a portrait of a graduate. What's your role and capacity in helping provide to those outcomes? I think that could be a very strong tool for framing their work for the next several years.
Well, my comments bring it back to our existing policy. So it was part of our packet, what we already have in place. And starting with looking at our guidance and counseling policy 2300P, it specifically states, school counselors engage in development, counseling, and short-term responsive counseling. School counselors shall not attempt to engage in long-term therapy or diagnosis of disorders, which are best left to appropriate outside agencies. To me, I think that's what needs to be brought back to the forefront and made sure, as you were talking, Dr. Cook, and same with Trustee May and Trustee Morse's comments about the counselors formulating some procedure. I think it's really hard to know when is one or two sessions, now stretching beyond that, a long-term therapy, or is that considered not long-term? I think our counselors need to really get on the same page and propose a procedure for when is the transition, how do we identify short-term, assistance versus when is it becoming something that kids are reaching out more often than once or twice, so that response can be appropriate under our existing policy. I also think that, our policy goes on to say within there that we are assisting students or counseling students during times of transition, separation, heightened stress, and critical change. So these are all things that are outlined in there that are not prone to multiple sessions with a child or multiple engagement with a child. And I think that's the intent of the policy we have in place. And if if the board feels that this is not the intent of what needs to happen, then we should discuss a change. But right now, I'm hearing that we're all in agree. Counselors are the pit stop for crisis, are the pit stop for interventions, triage, as Trustee May brilliantly stated it, and that's what they need to remain. What needs to, I think, be clarified is when does that change? When does that dynamic change? And what do we do about that in terms of involving parents? The other piece that I think is really important is we do have a policy called Parental Rights 2425. And in that policy, it already says a parent, guardian who has an objection to their child's participation in the district's adopted curriculum and/or the district's implementation of practices, policies, and procedures in accordance with educational mandates on the basis that it harms the child or impairs the parent's firmly held beliefs, values, or principles may withdraw their child from the activity, class, or program. And in my opinion, that squarely would fall into a parent's right to withdraw a child from the option of counseling within the school. So I think we have policy in place that allows for a parent's decision-making on that piece of it, if they are aware that counseling is offered within the school. That's a right that they have within our policy now as it exists. We have policy that outlines what our counselors' obligations are. And I just want to address a couple of the comments I've seen in emails. And Dr. Cook, you can confirm or deny this to the extent you know it, but I am not aware of any counselor that promotes an LGBTQ agenda within our school or with any child. That is not a part of any statement I've ever seen. Have you heard of anything like that happening where we're promoting that?
I have not.
Okay. I'm also not aware of any of our counselors encouraging sexual activity by any of our children. Have you ever heard of that happening?
I have not.
Okay. And I also want to make it clear that there's been some statements about our sexual education programs and whether or not parents have the right to opt out or opt in. This is 100% a curriculum that parents can opt out of, and permission slips are sent home. I have a 5th grader that I just got a permission slip on. I can tell you, at least at her elementary school, and I assume that's a school-wide policy, that's happening. And so I just want to maybe get rid of some of the rumor. We do have policy in place, and to the extent that policy was not or has not been followed, then the appropriate action is or would be taken. And I am not aware of this policy being violated in the circumstance that brought this to us or in any other circumstance. And so I think we have what we need. I think there needs to be some procedure work underneath our policy to help define for counselors, help them understand amongst themselves, where do we bring that defining line. Those are my thoughts.
I would agree with those and just ask, like everyone has already said, listening to our counselors and bringing them into that conversation as well, as it affects their day-to-day work and what they do for our kids and what they provide for our kids in our buildings on a day-to-day basis. That none of us up here have any idea because we don't walk in their shoes. So I'm very eager to hear their perspective and their insights, and maybe we can get something that would be supportive in any way that we can be for everyone.
Yeah, my comment was just, I think the piece of the procedure that does need to be clarified is when a counselor reaches out and they can't contact the legal guardian. It's very difficult, I think, for them, and so maybe some guidance that's consistent across the district when that situation happens. How do we proceed, and what avenues do they have? And maybe they already have it in place and they can share that with us. But it seems as though that was also discussed, that we're not reaching out to parents, and I think our counselors work very hard to contact legal guardian at all times. And from what I've read, and what I've read from our counselors, that's the basis for their work that they do. They want parents to be involved every step of the way. And so just wanted to give our community confidence that is happening and that is their goal. And we should continue that, and maybe it needs to be put into procedure so it's clear and it's stated and everybody can be comfortable with that.
Yeah, that's something certainly for me that I need to see in the procedure. I'd like to see in the procedure is how is that done? What happens if you can't? Just those sorts of things, just for consistency across 18 buildings now. I think that's important to have that resource and, for our staff so they can do what they do. But, I think they would agree, and I think we've heard it from our counselors over the last week or two, that having parent involvement is an integral part in solving any issue that they're dealing with. And so I think we want to strengthen that. We don't obviously want to ruin that, and there's got to be trust. And I think that's part of what this is all about, right? Is just strengthening that trust and the relationship and the collaboration between the school and the parents, so we can help their children, or help them help their children. Dr. Cook, do you have an idea on what that would look like as far as getting our counseling folks together and having some of that conversation and then bringing that back to us? Or?
Yeah, it strikes me that policy currently serves sufficiently in the path forward, and what I would like us to consider is to have our counselors spend a little bit of time developing some common expectations and how that manifests under current policy and the way it would look procedurally. And what I would suggest we do is spend a little bit of time drafting out some of those conversations and some of the guidance that counselors could build that feedback on. And I would actually suggest that there's probably going to be some pretty strong conversations about differences that might need to exist between elementary and secondary students, just because the needs and the demands are so different at those levels. And I think, I also don't want to understate the extreme demands on their work time overall in general. They are working tremendously every moment of the day that they have students in session, because it's the one time that they've got their clients and their people that they're working with right at their availability. And so I do think this is going to be crucial for giving them some consistency across our 18 schools. And I think it would be a good conversation for them to have at both levels, and how we do a vertical kind of transition of that plan, and how it all fits into our strategic plan as we want to move forward with building those capacities for kids. And kids are different, and individual kids have different needs. And I think that's one of the things that we've been professing since the beginning. That's the reason for an equity framework, is that you don't treat every kid the exact same. Kids have different needs, and counselors know and recognize that, maybe arguably more than any of our employees to that regard. And so what I would recommend is that we give them, the audience, the opportunity to sit down and kind of talk this through and see if we can balance what are those, kind of that tight, loose model of what are those common expectations that don't tie their hands to the extent that it means that they can't do their jobs in support of students. And what does that look like? And I think we could very easily, that framing that out and then giving them that time to have those really deep, meaningful conversations and capture those expectations and bring that back to this board for the board's consideration and sharing that out. And I think having that connected to the policy that's existing currently would be a recommendation I would be highly supportive of.
Dr. Cook, I had one last question or comment about some feedback that we received. Is our counselors provide a very unique services, like we've discussed, and they have a very unique set of training, education behind them. But who functions as their supervisor? Where do they fit in the paradigm? And some feedback that I heard was maybe it would be nice for them to have someone that's either the lead counselor or supervisor that can help them with some collaboration, some accountability, and some transparency, and just really connect with our parents and let them know that the role that they're serving. And we could have avoided some misunderstanding of the role of our counselors. And so maybe speak to where are they in line in our district, and I think separating them out, elementary versus middle and high school, very unique roles, very unique set of student populations, that would be fantastic. But just generally, are they collaborating? Do they have resources available to them, and someone that's checking in, making sure that we're kind of like Trustee Morrisville said, we're following guidance that's set forth by the district through policy, et cetera.
Very fair question. And I think the first thing I would start and lead with is I would tell you that their guidance comes through the national group of Asca. And Asca is highly reputable and is the group that all counselors across the country, school counselors, use as kind of their North star. As far as do we have a director of counseling or somebody that serves in that capacity? Not really. If we had more resources, then potentially that would be something that we'd have. Right now, we have some options that we could expand upon roles and responsibilities. Those would be additional expectations for people that maybe at the district level, or maybe we do something through with the counselors themselves, and maybe we establish some kind of lead positions or something like that. But it's it's similar in the regards to the way the nurses function. Their work is so important in the buildings, but it's also such nuanced and specific to a very specific skill set that a principal isn't necessarily always highly qualified to give explicit feedback on how they're doing that. They can lead and supervise the positions, but that is also, as a former principal, when I think about coaching my counselors or coaching a nurse, I can coach on things about the building and how they interact with people in the building, but specific to the expertise and the knowledge that they know and have, I'm going to struggle to give them meaningful and positive feedback. So I think there's some value in that discussion and maybe unpacking that to some extent, but I would agree with you that right now there is not somebody that sits at the top of that group of employees and can be that kind of focal lead in that content area that helps to dial in some of that. And it's I think a worthy conversation for us to have.
And I bet they might have some ideas about how that could happen or what it might look like. So it'd be interesting to hear their thoughts.
All right, hearing no other comment or questions. Dr. Cook, do you have any questions on what the board has sort of set out as its recommendation or suggestions?
I think what I would like to just make sure I understand is currently we feel confident and comfortable that policy right now exists as stands, meets the needs of the board's expectations at this point. It would be worthy to spend some time developing procedures for consistency, setting expectations, and how living under those policies are best served to meeting the needs of students and meeting the needs of parents and guardians in our community, so that we're kind of merging those two as tightly together as we possibly can without failing to meet the needs of either group in that regard. And then just really kind of bringing back something for the board's consideration after some period of diving in with our counselors and potentially making some recommendations to policy, to procedures, and potentially structure of how they fit and live under in an organization chart, and potentially how their work is going to be impacted by our strategic plan and the direction we're going forward in the near future. That's my understanding.
For me, at least, I'm not convinced there's not some policy tightening or rewriting that needs to be done, but I'd like to see kind of that document and the work from our counseling folks before I guess I know what that would look like. But even in the policy, it refers to, it kind of does it in two different ways, but the school counseling program, and it does that in all caps, which leads me to believe there's another document. So is that like an individual school document? Is that a district document? And maybe that's what we're talking about creating is, okay, this is what counseling looks like in District 271. And this is how we function. I'm not convinced that there's not some policy work to still be done, but I'd like to see that other document first.
Fair enough.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cook. And we have no other items on the agenda, and so with that, we will adjourn. Thank you.